Alright guys, so we're going to do corrections a little bit differently this time. I have given you a paper that has the problem that you have answered incorrectly, so what I would like you to do is you are completing those problems, and then you will do the we try problem together with me, and then that way you can have a better understanding as to how to answer correctly the quiz problem and then get half credit back. So you only need to watch the questions that you answered incorrectly. So here we go with number one. The number one, the we try problem, is an inequality problem, okay? So I want you to solve those to get x alone. So for x divided by negative 4 is greater than 5. Our first step, we have to say, okay, well, what are x and the negative 4 doing? They're dividing. So we're going to multiply both sides by negative 4. Once you do that, we multiply both sides by a negative. So remember, the rule is that the inequality symbol flips when you multiply or divide both sides by negative. So x is left over, and 5 times negative 4 is going to give me 20. So it should say x is less than negative 20. If you look at the second one, negative 9x is greater than negative 63. Again, looking at the negative 9 and the x, they are multiplying. So we'll use inverse operations to get x alone. That means we need to divide by negative 9 on both sides. Because negative 9 divided by negative 9 is 1, it cancels out. We're left with x. And again, we want to make sure that we notice that we are dividing by a negative on both sides, so we are flipping the sign. So to say x is less than negative 63 divided by negative 9 is going to be a positive 7. Alright, so if you did get that number one wrong, now you can pause the video and correct number one, which should be on the right side of the we try problem. Alrighty, for number two, it's a translation. It says 12 is 5 more than the product of a number and 8. A few things I would really recommend you kind of annotate the translation problems. That always helps me to kind of put numbers and symbols above the words before I go ahead and translate it. So 12 is easy, we just know that that's 12. Remember, is means equals. Okay, and then we have 5 more. More means plus, less would mean minus, than. We're going to go ahead and circle that than word because if we remember a little jingle, from, than, to, switcheroo. So when we see those words, we know that we're going to switch the order of the things we are adding or subtracting. The product means multiply, of a number. When we see the word a number, we know it's a variable, and 8. Okay, so really the one thing we can definitely put on the side is this 12 equals. We know that that's going to go, it doesn't matter either side, in the front or the back. So that's probably the easiest part to sort. So then it says the 5 more than, the product of a number and 8. So you have to ask yourself, okay, well, I think I'm adding two things. I'm adding 5, so that needs to say separate, and I'm adding the product of a number and 8 to that. Okay, so what would the product of a number and 8 look like? It would look like 8n. So we're adding 5 and 8n, but we have to figure out the order. Because of the switcheroo word, if it wasn't there, it would look like 5 plus 8n. But since it's there, we need to switch the order of the things we are adding. So it should say 12 equals 8n plus 5. Alright, so go ahead and pause the video if you got number 2 wrong, and try to correct number 2. Alright, number 3. The difference of the quotient of 6 and a number and the quotient of a 12 and another number is 77. Okay, so again, we're going to translate. If you got number 2 wrong, then you know that I already said you need to annotate these problems before writing anything down. Annotate means write little notes above the words. So the first word we're going to write a note above is difference. We know, we practiced this so many times, that difference means minus. Okay, then of the quotient. Quotient means divide. Product means multiply. Quotient means divide. So the quotient of 6 and a number meaning n, a variable, and the quotient, again divide, of 12 and another number. Since it says another number, it's a different variable from n, so we can't use n again. So why don't we use z? If it just said of a number and the quotient of 12 and a number, sure, we could use the n twice, but it specifically says of another number. Is always means equal to 77. So I'm going to go ahead and pop that is 77 on the end. That's a nice and easy thing to get rid of. If you go back to the problem, we know that we're dividing 6 6 and a number, and we're dividing 12 and a number. But what operation are we doing with those two things? We're dividing 6 and a number, and we're dividing 12 and a number. But we need to make sure that we put the right sign in between them, the right operation. So again, it goes back to difference. That means that we're subtracting 6 and a number, the quotient of 6 and a number, and, or from, 12 and a number. And this is a z, not to be confused with the 2. Okay, so 6 over n minus 12 over z equals 77. If you got number 3 wrong, go ahead and try to answer 3 correctly. You can pause the video. Alright, number 4. We have a nice little fraction on the u-try problem, or on the we-try problem. So negative 1 divided by 6x equals 12. So how do we get x alone? Well, we're going to have to multiply by the reciprocal. Remember, the reciprocal of any number is the inverse. So if I said 2/3, the reciprocal of 2/3 would be 3 over 2. This works out as the inverse because 2 over 3 is 6, and 3 over 2 is 6, so that's 6 over 6, which is equal to 1. Okay, so if we take a look at this problem specifically, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. Now, the reciprocal includes that negative sign. If it was just 6 over 1, if you just did this, we would be left with the negative x, and we don't want to be left with the negative x. We just want to know what x is alone. So we have to multiply by negative 6 over 1 on both sides. It's an equation, we keep it balanced. So these cancel out because 6 over 1 times 1 over 6 is 6 over 6, which is 1. So we're successful in getting x alone. And now, if you'd like to put a 1 underneath 12, you certainly can, but that won't change the value of it. Sometimes it just makes it more visual. And if I multiply straight across, I'm going to get 12 times negative 6 is negative 72 over 1. Divide that, x is still negative 72. Okay, go ahead and try number 4 if you answered that one incorrectly so you can get the correct answer. You may pause the video. Alright, moving on to number 5. When solving this equation, what would be your first step? Okay, so this is not multiple choice. On the quiz it was, but we're just going to take a look at this equation. On one side of the equal sign, the negative 16 is all by itself. We're not going to touch anything with that. Then you see it says 3x plus a negative 14. You always want to get, in an equation, get the variable alone, or isolate the variable. So in this case, we want to get x alone. Alright, so before we do that, we need to get rid of things that are around x. Before we can get rid of the coefficient, which is 3, we have to get rid of the constant. In a two-step equation, that's always our first step. But you see that there are 2 signs in front of that negative 14. So to simplify things, we always want to make our life simpler. I'm going to go ahead and simplify it to one sign. If we dump those doubles, a plus and a negative, it should become a negative. Okay? So negative 16 equals 3x minus 14. Now we can think about getting rid of the constant. What is the inverse of this negative 14? The inverse of the negative 14 is a positive 14. We would add 14 to both sides. So my answer would be add 14 to both sides. Just be careful because sometimes they will throw those 2 signs in there and you want to make sure that you dump the doubles correctly before getting rid of the 14 and moving 14 to the other side. If you got number 5 wrong, go ahead and pause the video and correct number 5. Alright, for number 6, you have a graph and you're asked which inequality is represented by the graph. Okay, so in this case, you have to solve all of the inequalities for x. We can't just take a look at them and figure it out. Now, there would be one hint I would give you. If you take a look at b, how is b different from the rest? B has a greater than or equal to sign under it. And we know that that has to be a closed circle when we graph things, which does not match the open circle in the graph. Okay, so B you don't really have to solve because you know that that open circle doesn't match the greater than or equal to sign doesn't match the open circle. Alright, so let's take a look at A. X plus 7 is greater than negative 11. In order to get x alone, we're going to have to do the inverse of the plus 7. So that would be subtract 7 from both sides. Okay, now x would be alone, and we'd bring down our sign. We're not going to flip any symbols because we didn't divide or multiply by a negative. But then you're going to say, well, what's negative 11 minus 7? That's going to give me negative 18, which does not match the graph. Okay, so now let's try C. Negative 2x is less than 8. We're going to go ahead and divide both sides by negative 2 because that's how we can get x by itself. These cancel out, and you're left with x. Negative 8 divided by negative 2 is negative 4. And again, we flip the symbol, the inequality symbol, because we divide by a negative on both sides. So it says x is greater than negative 4. Does that match the graph? Why, yes, it does. So C would be our correct answer. If you need to correct number 6, please go ahead and stop the video and correct number 6. All right, for number... There we go. For number 7, question is, for which inequalities is 2 a solution? If you were listening to the last problem, it's very similar to this one in the fact that x is not by itself in any of them, so we have to make sure that we solve for x in order to figure out which ones that 2 is a solution for. These are a little bit tricky because they are not equations. If it was an equation, we could just solve for x and say, okay, well, x equals this, so I know that 7 is the solution. But these are inequalities, so it's a little different, and you'll see what I mean. So for the first one, x plus 8 is greater than 14. We're going to subtract 8 from both sides to get x alone. Once we do that, we have x, we bring down our inequality symbol, and 14 minus 8 is going to give you 6. Okay, so what does this say? It says x is greater than 6. We have to read it out in order to figure out if 7 is a solution. Or you could plug in 7 and say 7 is greater, oh, not 7, sorry, 2 is greater than 6. Is that a true statement? 2 is greater than 6? No, it is not. Okay, so A, or the first choice, could not be a solution. 2 could not be a solution for the first inequality. All right, take a look at the second one. 3x is greater than or equal to negative 9. I'm going to divide by 3 on both sides. Okay, this cancels out my 3. I'm left with x. I do not need to flip the sign. I'm only dividing by negative on one side. So we have x is greater than or equal to negative 3. So is 2 greater than or equal to negative 3? Yes, it is. So this would be a solution. 2 would be a solution for this inequality. And if we take a look at the last one, x minus 12 is less than 20. We're going to add 12 to both sides, and we get x is less than 32. Okay, so x is less than, read it out, 32. Is 2 less than 32? Question mark. Why, yes, it is. Okay, so both would be, both inequalities would have 2 as a solution. Very important to follow through and read the inequality out to yourself. All right, if you need to read your number 7, go ahead and pause the video and do so. Alrighty, so this one was a pretty straightforward function question from the quiz. The only thing that was different maybe was that the XY table was horizontal instead of vertical and up and down. So basically, when you are given a function that's a fraction, you can turn that function or that fraction into a decimal. So if we turn 1/4 into a decimal, you could say 0.25. Y equals 0.25, and you're just plugging in the x values that they give you to find the y values. So I'm plugging in negative 2. So if you calculate 0.25 times negative 2, you're going to get negative 0.5. So we're just filling in the chart. If I took 0.25 for 1/4 and I multiplied it by 0, I'm going to get 0. Now if I took y equals 0.25 and multiplied by 1, I'm going to get 0.25. Anything times 1 is itself. And lastly, I have y equals 0.25 or 1/4 times 2, and that's going to give me 0.5 or half. Okay? So if you got this one incorrect on the quiz, go ahead and pause the video and answer number 8. Alright, so it says the table shows the number of pages used to make short learn to read books. If the pattern continues, how many pages would be used to make 14 books? So if you look at the top on the number of books, it goes in an arithmetic sequence. It goes 2, 4, 6, 8. So we're asked to find all the way to 14. So I would just extend my table, 10, 12, 14. Okay. Now the bottom, it doesn't look like quite as clear of a pattern. It goes 35, 67, 99, 131. So you really have to figure out what pattern, because it says there as a pattern, if the pattern continues, you have to figure out what the pattern is that goes from 35 to 67 to 99 and so on. Now, if we're looking at these two numbers, 67 is a prime number, so I'm not going to assume that anything multiplies to get to that from 35. So instead of doing that, we can find the difference between the two numbers. So what is the difference between them? Well, we can subtract. So the difference would be 2 and 3, 32. So if I add 32 to 35, I'm going to get 67. Now, let's see if that continues on. 67 plus 32, what does that give me? Well, 99, okay? So then I'm going to keep going. It is 99 plus 32, 131. 11, 10, 11, 12, 13. Yep, 131. So to continue the pattern, I'm just going to keep adding 32 until I get to the 14 books to figure out how many pages it takes to make them. So 131 plus 32, I'm going to get 163. Now I'm going to keep adding 32 to that. So 5, 9, and 1. 195. And one more time, add 32. So I'm going to get a 7, an 8, and a 1. So, oops, not an 8. Miss Storch. Whew. Let's try that again. 195 plus 32. 7 here. 2 up 2. So 227 pages would be enough, and would be used to make the 14 books. Alright, if you got that one incorrect, please pause the video and try number 9 on your own. And we're at the last one, number 10, solve for x. Okay, so this is a two-step equation. We have to make sure that we get the constant on the other side first. Our constant in this case is the negative 3. So what's the opposite of a negative 3? Good, a positive 3. Okay, so negative 3 plus 3 cancels out. I'm done with that. I'm going to bring everything else down. X divided by negative 8 equals 17 plus 3 is 20. Okay, now it's a one-step equation. I see that I have an x and a divide by negative 8. In order to get x alone, I'm going to have to multiply by negative 8 on both sides. So 20 times negative 8 would give me negative 160, and this cancels out. So I'm left with x equals negative 160. Very important to note that that was a negative 8, so you had to multiply by a negative 8 in order for them to cancel out completely. Alright, if you got number 10 wrong, please go ahead and try number 10 on your own.